Catus Maximus here. We got a Porter Cable 7301 Type 2. We can see we're replacing the bearings. We can see that the base plate's been replaced on this unit. It appears we got some damage here, so I suspect this was dropped with the bit in it. Anyway, to give you an idea of what we're doing here, I actually have a Type 1. This has a lot more use, but this is what it should sound like. Although this one could probably use some new bearings at some point. This one is completely shot. Like, wow, the bearings are just gone on that. Only paid 12 bucks, but now I understand why. So anyway, we're just gonna pull off the base here. And we're going to pull off the top of the motor because we have to release the brushes. And we're going to hope in my little box of bearings, you can see in the upper left hand corner, that I have the appropriate bearings to replace what we got in there. Anyway, we'll go ahead and release these brushes, which is got a couple little Torx fasteners in there. They are T9s. Fortunately, this is going to be just a little bit of a hassle. We're going to have to pull off both the terminals for these brushes. We got to get the brushes out because we have to pull the whole motor out. Interestingly enough, these are T9 fasteners. Get the other one out. Fortunately, it's an entire little cartridge here, which makes it pretty easy to deal with. The brushes still have plenty of life left into them. There's a little spring down in there. At least it's relatively easy to deal with. And to try to keep track, because you do generally want to put the brushes back in the same position, I'll kind of set them off to the side like this. Now we just pull the motor out from the bottom. Actually, what I'm realizing here is we got to pull this out. I don't know if I can get the... There's our collet. And since this has a lock there, it may be easier to remove this lower bearing retention ring before I actually pull the motor out. Finding the right tool to remove this ring is probably going to be the most difficult part for most people. I have some of these 90-degree snap ring pliers, so that will work just fine. That thing is on there pretty tight. So instead of risking damaging the lock screw, I am going to pull the motor out and then use soft jaws in the vise. Surprisingly enough, the upper bearing is still pretty good. The lower bearing is really what's ruined. Definitely was tight. This is just a retention ring, so the motor goes to the housing, goes to the bearing, and then that retention ring just keeps the whole spindle nice and tight against the bearing. And then the bearing is also captured with this block, which is what they need to do when it comes to routers, because the bearings do need to be held real tightly in place. So it's a bit of effort. You got to remove quite a few screws. These don't have Loctite, but they have some kind of, you know, a real mild Loctite. Maybe Loctite green. It appears to be some kind of resin or something that they've put in there. Keep these screws from wanting to come loose, because there is a lot of vibration in these. But they're not super tight. There's our retention plate. And there's our little bearing. There's our bearing. Happens to be a 6002 RS. And yeah, that thing is Chinese bearing, unfortunately. And it is totally shot. Fortunately, 6002 bearings are actually pretty common. I had this Torn brand, so I'm going to go ahead and use that and just pop it together. Really is pretty easy. What's actually harder is to replace this rear bearing because you have this little protection disc here. Usually it's not held on too tight, but you need like a valve spring compressor that uses a pull or something that's going to be able just to get right at the edge of the bearing in that slot and then be able to pop it off without damaging that little protection disc. Just slightly tap in the bearing, and in this case you don't actually have to get the bearing all the way seated. If you are just using a hammer and a socket to go around remember to go around the outer edge, because you don't want to pound on the inner edge because that puts load on the bearing balls. All you have to do is get it seated a little bit, and then you can actually use this little collar here or this retention to keep it seated the rest of the way. Don't forget to actually put the lock back in. Make sure these screws are good and tight, but don't use like a big impact driver. You want to make sure they're tight, but it is aluminum and it'll be easy to strip. And just like that, we've got it all back together. Nice and tight in the metal housing. Now you just reassemble. Once you get it all reassembled, pretty easy to test. So I happen to have an extra bearing. A bearing like that's going to be like $5 or somewhere around there, maybe 6 or 7. It really depends. But for the $12 I paid for this and having a bearing in stock, that was actually a pretty good deal for a Type 2. And once again, root cause of why that happened, just seeing the damage here and the damage here, I suspect it was dropped. And that's really what took out. It could have just been bad luck. It also can be other situations. If you're doing a lot of hardwoods and using larger router bits, they can beat up the bearings too, and so it could have just been used hard and simply wore out the bearing a little bit sooner. Anyway, nice and tight, and it can really be that easy just to swap out a bearing. So just want to make a little video just so people can have something to go after. I guess the hardest thing about it is this collar. If you, like for me, I had those 90-degree angle snap ring pliers and a vise with soft jaws, or you use a couple pieces of wood or something, so it's easy just to put the motor in the vise and then use those, press down on those 90-degree snap ring pliers and be able to break this lock ring and be able to torque it back down when I was finished. That's going to be the most challenging aspect. Otherwise, the bearings aren't pressed in super tight, so you can just tap them out real easy with the socket. And replacing the back bearing is probably going to be the more challenging endeavor. In this case, I decided to leave it, although I do know it needs to be replaced pretty soon. But I don't use a ton of these a lot, and of course I have others. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Till next time, Catus Maximus out.